Mr. Murphy, you have an amendment at the desk.
I have an amendment at the desk which meets all of your requirements, sir.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania. Page 732, after line 17, insert the following new section and make the necessary.
Without objection, the
change.
amendment will be considered as read. Gentleman will be recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Chairman, in the final sentence, there's a typo. It has the word secretary. It should be administrator, referring to the administrator of the EPA, as was in.
Do you wish to ask unanimous consent?
You ask unanimous consent that be.
Without objection, that'll be the order.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This bill we reviewed has been something that people have debated whether it's going to cost more in energy taxes or groceries or clothes or their cars. Now, if we can't guarantee we won't see higher energy prices or higher gasoline prices or higher home electricity costs, let's at least guarantee we're not going to lose jobs. We've seen the ads on TV lately saying that we're going to see some growth in green jobs, and that's good. But let's not lose sight or concern for the jobs that have been so important to our nation for so long, in particular, steel. Now, we're proud of steel in Pittsburgh. We're proud that our steel has built the skyscrapers in New York City, that magnificent Gateway Arch in St. Louis, and the picturesque Golden Gate Bridge, all made by Pittsburgh steelworkers. But throughout America, American steel has been the arsenal of democracy and the foundation of our nation's strength. But in the 1970s and 1980s, we saw steel jobs decline. Tens of thousands of jobs left the United States, not because the world no longer needed steel, but because the world wanted less expensive steel. And since 1974, America has lost 367,000 steel jobs. So steel mills opened up all around the world where countries made steel and steel products with lower wages, low benefits, lower and non-existent pollution standards, and lots of government subsidies from foreign governments. Over and over, we fought for American-made steel, and over we all went to rallies and stood up for steel. I'm sure many in this room spoke up at those rallies and told the crowds we were with them. We pledged to all those worried workers we would no longer stand by and watch other nations take our jobs. We promised. We promised we would never let them down. We promised we would not let U.S. policy weaken our own competitiveness. Many of us introduced bills to impose tariffs against countries that illegally dump steel in the United States. Many of us spoke out against the inferior products made in other nations and sent to our shores. Many have signed on as co-sponsors to legislation recently introduced by Congressman Tim Ryan and myself to stop any nation from illegal currency manipulation so we could level the playing field for steel and protect American workers. We all spoke out in church halls and fire halls and labor halls that we would push for fair trade and oppose any and all policies by the United States or other countries to put us, our families, our workers at a competitive disadvantage. Well, now it's time to put our promises to work, and it's time to make good on our pledges. We've lost too many jobs in America to even risk losing more, and the bleeding must stop. Back when thousands of those steel jobs were disappearing in the United States, I remember working as a psychologist in Pittsburgh and having counseled so many of those families that were so stressed by difficulty paying bills, threatened marriages, kids having trouble in school. I remember telling one family they didn't need a doctor, they needed jobs. Now, we're all for doing many things to clean up our air. We have to conserve, not waste energy. We have to use every ounce of innovation and creativity to maximize our energy efficiency and alternate energy development. But we must also explore those resources we have now, such as oil and coal, and put them to work. We must crack the scientific codes to solve our problems of pollution and emissions, solve our problems with real science, not political science. We can do this with Republicans and Democrats standing together. That's why Representatives Neil Abercrombie, Lee Terry, Jim Costa, Joe Wilson, Tim Walz, Shelley Moore Capito, and I wrote and introduced a bill, H.R. 2227, the American Conservation and Clean Energy Independence Act, to cut our dependence on foreign oil, explore our own resources, but to dedicate the revenues to build clean coal plants, nuclear power plants, clean up our nation's water pollution, broken sewer systems, our streams, our rivers, and our coasts. By contrast, the bill before us doesn't put much money at all into clean coal, not even enough to build a fraction of a plant. Our current plants are old, built at a time when they use slide rules, not computers. We can't rebuild America by a complicated system of taxes, trades, rebates, and exemptions to special interests, but we can embark on the largest building of our infrastructure in our history by using resources from oil and gas and coal to clean our air, land, and water. We can create jobs to raise families comfortably, jobs here in the USA, jobs that don't send money to foreign countries. I want everyone to stop and think about those rallies for jobs that we've all been to, look into the eyes of American workers, think about the rough hands and broad shoulders of America's makers of steel, and say to them, when you needed us, we were here for you. Let's tell them we weren't just putting a cap on emissions, we were willing to put a cap on American job losses. Let's stand up for American steel. Let us say that at this time, this important, essential, pivotal time in our history, that when America was worried about jobs to feed their families, clothe their kids, and send their sons and daughters off to school, we stood by to their sides and said, America, we are here to ensure we will not abandon our workers again. We're here to stand up for steel, cap the job losses, and keep America strong. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair recognizes Mr. Doyle. Speak on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Is this for comment on the Murphy amendment?
Yes, we're debating the Murphy amendment. It's been presented to us.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd just like to make some comments about what we've tried to do in this bill to make sure that we don't lose jobs in the steel industry. And I'd like to start by quoting a letter that was sent to us by the international president of the United Steelworkers Union, Leo Gerard, who represents all of the steelworkers that Mr. Murphy talks about and that mostly reside in the 14th Congressional District, where we have U.S. Steel's two active steel plants, Edgar Thomson and Braddock, and Mon Valley Works in West Mifflin. This is from the International President of Steelworkers. Leo Gerard, International President of the United Steelworkers Union, today praised the progress made by the U.S. House Energy and Commerce Committee in its work to pass comprehensive climate change legislation with the following statement. The USW has been working to ensure that the new products and processes which will build the clean energy economy and solve the challenge of climate change are created here in the United States and built by American workers. We believe that addressing climate change and ensuring the strength of our nation's manufacturing sector can be compatible goals. We are grateful for the leadership shown on this critical issue by the members of the House Energy and Commerce Committee, particularly Chairman Waxman and Markey and Representatives Doyle and Inslee. I'm pleased that they, along with many stakeholders in the labor, business, and environmental communities, have reached consensus on a way forward that balances the need to address climate change with the need to ensure that U.S. workers and industries are not unfairly hurt in the process. By providing rebates to energy-intensive manufacturers based on their output and efficiency, the House has created a strong incentive to maintain or increase domestic production and to improve efficiency in the process. These rebates ensure that all of those producers at or above the industry average efficiency are not penalized. Also, the rebates will remain in place at their full level until either a strong and enforceable global agreement has been reached or until the U.S. implements a program to equalize carbon costs between domestic and foreign producers. The combination of rebates and international programs will ensure continued domestic competitiveness and reduce the potential that our efforts in the U.S. to combat greenhouse gases will be more than offset by the increases elsewhere in the world. Preventing this carbon emissions leakage is critical if the goal of stopping climate change is to be met. Congressman Waxman and Markey, Congressman Doyle and Inslee, and the rest of the Energy and Commerce Committee realize this fundamental fact and have crafted a strong and flexible policy to prevent it. This, Mr. Chairman, from the International President of the United Steelworkers Union, I think it is quite clear in this bill that the members of this committee have worked hard to ensure that no harm is done to our carbon-intensive industry that have trade competition. This is a bill that will create jobs. Every wind turbine that we build in the United States uses 200 tons of steel. I can tell you the steel workers that reside in my district, and they all reside in my district, are looking forward to building those wind turbines using that 200 tons of steel. The grid, the transmission grid that's going to have to be built to transmit the solar energy and the wind energy all across this country is going to be built by U.S. workers in the steel industry. Mr. Chairman, I think it's pretty clear from this letter from the United Steelworkers Union that the people who work in steel and the people who represent those that work in steel think that we've done a pretty good job in protecting their interest and protecting our jobs here in America, and I use
Will the
that
gentleman
balance
yield?
of my time. Yeah, I'm sorry?
Will the gentleman yield?
Who is asking me to yield? Yes, I will, Mr. Gingrey.
I appreciate the gentleman yielding, and
What's that?
gentleman certainly has done a fantastic job of trying to preserve jobs and mitigate the losses in his district, and he talks about that letter, and they're duly praising him. But I have, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chairman, here a report from the Heritage Foundation talking about some of the job losses in specific districts of members of the Energy and Commerce Committee. Mr. Doyle, in your 14th of Pennsylvania, the Heritage Foundation estimates 4,977 jobs lost in the year.
Well, reclaiming my
11.
time, Mr. Gingrey, in Pittsburgh, we don't care much what the Heritage Foundation says. We care what the Steelworkers Union president says, because we know who has the interest of workers in Pittsburgh, and it's not the Heritage Foundation.
Gentleman's time has expired. Who seeks recognition on the Murphy Amendment? Yes, gentleman from Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And actually, I do have great respect for Mike Doyle, and I know he's worked hard to craft this. I would just ask Mike just one question. What if the General Secretary of the United Steelworkers is wrong? I mean, what if he's wrong? What if there is great job loss?
Well, I would just say to my friend that any time that you embark on something new and bold and challenging from the future, you know, when the president said that we're going to put a man on the moon and nobody knew how to do that, a lot of people thought maybe he was crazy at the time or maybe he was wrong. There's no guarantees in life, John.
I get it.
What I'm saying is we've crafted a bill to deal with these situations.
Yeah, and I'm just saying it's still patriotic to not believe in the product advertising of a bill that's going to raise the price of electricity and energy because you're monetizing carbon. So what we've been trying to do is say when you're going to raise energy costs, manufacturing is going to be harmed. You have negotiated diligently to try to offset that. Now, we're going to find out, if this bill ever becomes law, we'll find out who's right and who's wrong. You know, I hope you're right. I fear you're wrong. And if you're wrong, all we're saying is there ought to be an insurance policy. So all these amendments are trying to say that if we have great job leakage, which means job loss, we better stop. We better, as Chairman Waxman said, to Mr. Scalise, we better stop digging the hole. And that's why we're never going to come to agreement. But I think our votes are always going to be, for the most part, to say, if you have bet wrong, our insurance policy is we're going to have an opportunity with our votes to say, $5 gas is too high, we better change course. This amount of job loss is too much, we better change course. There's no insurance policy in this bill unless through the process we amend it and perfect it. And I mean, you know we have great respect for you and your work.
My friend Yield,
I would.
I hear what you're saying, and you know, if I'm wrong or if you're wrong, John, we don't suffer too much. If Leo's wrong, this is his membership. This is his life. These are his brothers and sisters. I think that he's thought very long and hard, and he asked very tough questions as we sat down and talked about how do we craft this bill in a way that helps him. He has a lot to lose if he's wrong. The fact that he has faith in what we're trying to do, I think, gives this the credibility that you and I could never give it.
But I will tell you, going back to the experience that I saw in Southern Illinois with the mine workers after the last Clean Air Act amendments, the politicians were there fighting for their jobs, the mine was still closed. And we'll have a chance to talk about mine worker jobs. So I have a great fear that yeah.
On this is.
I know the Harvard-educated Wall Street trader who's the mayor of that town.
I know that you like to put your mine workers up there. These are my steel workers. Okay?
The gentleman yield.
And they're some of the best in the world. And
I know the Harvard-educated mayor who looks like a steel mill worker who's the mayor. I would like to yield to my colleague and friend, Mr. Murphy from Pennsylvania.
I think that's your baseball team this year.
I'd like to also talk about many of these steel workers also live in the 18th Congressional District. And I want to point out this chart here, if I could. This has to do with the amount of emissions that come from different countries: China, European Union, Japan, and the United States. The U.S. makes steel efficiently and also makes the least amount of emissions compared to these other things. Now, I want to say that this is not just the blast furnaces, which is here in this purple color, but also electric arc furnaces, which use massive amounts of electricity to melt their steel. And we do know the electric costs are going to go up. I also want to note that the Steel Manufacturers Association are also deeply concerned about this bill. We all are. Look, in 1974, we had 521,000 jobs in steel. We have 150-some thousand now or less. And our steel production has been there. Let's give a guarantee to these steel workers. I think the world of Leo Gerard, too. He's a good man, and the steel workers are great people. Why not give them an insurance policy? I go back.
Time has expired. The chairman would like to recognize himself for 5 minutes. I think that when we ask each other, do we know whether we're going to be right or wrong and what we're trying to accomplish, I think we ought to ask ourselves, are we better off now? We have an 8.9% unemployment rate right now. 13.7 million Americans unemployed last month. Steelworkers have been losing their jobs for years. And for those who want to question whether the bill that the Steelworkers Union and the steel industry are supporting are wrong, I think they have to answer back to you, were you right in backing the Bush administration in allowing so many of these jobs to leave? Were you right in backing the Bush administration not to regulate the market so we wouldn't see the abuses that we now see?
Will the chairman yield?
No, I'm not going to yield yet.
NAFTA?
I voted against NAFTA. How did you vote?
I wasn't here, but President Clinton signed it into law.
Well, I must tell you this. Most of the votes for NAFTA were Republican votes.
Except for the Democrats.
Most of the votes for NAFTA were Republican votes. There are a lot of people, especially Republicans, some Democrats as well, believe that the doctrine of free trade would work out for everybody's benefit. There might be some steel workers who lose their jobs, but they're going to have other jobs they can turn to. And nobody's ever admitted that was not in the interest of the steel workers. So when you ask, is this worth trying out, this legislation that we're now reviewing? Well, is the alternative to go back to where we are now, to where we've been, to have the kind of policies we've had in this country? Not just in trade, but policies that eviscerated the regulatory agencies to protect workers on job safety, to even increase the minimum wage, which we had a very difficult time because President Bush would not accept it for such a very long period of time. The amendment that's being offered says, if it doesn't work out for the steel workers, if there are more job losses, well, specifically more than 10,000 jobs been lost in the steel industry, that the title will no longer cease to have any force and effect. If that happens, you're back now to where we are today. Is that a successful place to be? I don't think that that would be the right answer. If the policy is not working out, then we're going to have to come up with another policy, not the failed policies that we've seen that have cost so many steelworkers jobs, have moved so many industries overseas. So I know you're sincere. On the other hand, it's hard to not recognize a pattern. If this happens, the bill's gone. If this happens, the bill's gone. And you say it's an insurance policy. It sounds to me like a political way of trying to raise people's concerns and fears that maybe it won't work. But what we've had has not worked. It hasn't worked for American jobs. It certainly hasn't worked for the steel industry. It hasn't worked for the workers there. Go tell them they're better off with no law. And I think they've looked at it and said, maybe there's a chance in this legislation to really transform our economy, that we can restructure our economy and create more jobs. We've already given up the idea that we don't manufacture things in the United States. Let's rethink that. Let's bring manufacturing back here. We want to kickstart our economy with clean energy jobs. We'll go on to reestablish American leadership in clean technology industries. If we develop these clean technologies, people around the world are going to be waiting to buy it. And I'd rather they buy it from us than to buy it from China or some other country that won't even be attempting to do what we want to do here in the United States. So I would urge a rejection of this amendment. And I'll yield the last 30 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You all know that I represent Silicon Valley, and it's a place that really offers a great deal of hope to the country. Entrepreneurs, risk takers, not afraid to take on the big questions. Many of you have traveled through and visited with many of the places there, the small companies, the medium-sized, and even the large.
Without objection, I'd like another 2 minutes so I can yield to the gentlelady. No objection being heard. The gentlelady has 2 additional minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The reason I'm raising this is because there's such skepticism and an underlying fear, as if we're going to go off the edge of a precipice. Let me tell you that the entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley are chomping at the bit, excited, can't wait to see the results of this bill in order to grow and to build and to manufacture all that will be part of a new part of our national economy. Now, I mean, the people that I'm speaking of don't change their party registration simply because I represent them. I mean, they are known around the world for what they have built, how they think, and what they do. And there are many of them that are your persuasion of party registration rather than mine. But they are highly, highly confident in what we are doing and why we need to do it. And I share this with you now, hopefully giving you a little inoculation, kind of a vitamin B shot. I mean, we're Americans, for heaven's sakes. Where is it written that we can't do, that we don't know how, that we are afraid? Mr. Chairman, thank you for allowing me to say something, but I think maybe that's why I stayed here all the time everybody else was gone. I listened to the skepticism, but I want to share the optimism that is there by some of the best minds and some of the best leaders in our country. Thank you.
I'm going to reclaim my time.
Thank
you come from an area of the country where they didn't sit around and say nothing can be done. They created whole new enterprises using their minds, using some of the resources that came about from government investments. And I think we have to recognize not that we can't do this, we can't do that, because the status quo is no great bargain, but that we can do a lot more than we've been doing. And we've got to do more than we've been doing because our whole independence as a country and our need for new jobs demands it. Mr. Barton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to speak in support of the Murphy Amendment. I have been relatively quiet on some of these specific protection amendments, but I do want the record to show I don't have a steel manufacturing capability in my district where you start from iron ore and coke and create the steel. But I do have 2 of the most efficient, if not the most efficient in the world, mini mills in my congressional district, one located in Jewett, Texas, and the other in Midlothian, Texas, that take scrap cars and metal and melt it down in an electric arc furnace. They're the two largest users of electricity in the state of Texas. Those two facilities, plus a fabrication facility in Grapeland, Texas, between them employ between 1,500 and 2,000 steel, what we call steel workers. Now, they're not the kind of steel workers that Mr. Doyle has, where they create the steel from raw materials, but they do recycle steel, and they do fabricate steel. Until this last year, where we've had this recession, those facilities were working overtime and were very profitable. They have not been negatively impacted by NAFTA. I would point out that Mexico makes very little steel. We may have had job losses to Mexico because of NAFTA in other areas, but not in steel. Our competitors in steel are China and India, and to some extent Great Britain and Japan. It is not Mexico. And I voted for NAFTA. And NAFTA has quadrupled trade between Mexico, Canada, and the United States. Doesn't mean there haven't been some job losses, but on a net basis, there have been jobs created in the United States, jobs created in Canada, and jobs created in Texas. But back on the steel, which is the focus of this amendment, what Mr. Murphy is saying here is that if, in fact, the proponents of this legislation are wrong and 10,000 jobs in the steel sector do disappear, then this title, not the whole bill, this title shall cease. Now, if you think about it, one of the largest components in the cost of steel is the price of energy. And all your offsets and all your allowances and all of your rebates doesn't detract from the fact that electricity prices are going to go up, not down. Now, you may get some rebates and you may get, but electricity prices are going to go up. And I know for a fact that a $500 million steel improvement project, which was designed to go to Grapeland, Texas, at the existing Nucor facility, did not go there because the price differential in electricity in Texas and some states that I'm not going to name, Texas was 3 cents above the price of electricity than the state that project went to. You cannot sit here and tell us that if prices go up for electricity in this country because of this bill, that some steel jobs are not going to be lost, because electricity is a huge component. So all this amendment says is, if we lose 10,000 jobs, the thing that caused the price to go up, we're going to stop implementing it. If you don't think prices are going to go up in electricity, you're not going to lose anything by voting for this amendment. But if Mr. Shimkus and Mr. Murphy are right, it is a protector. We don't want Mike Doyle to lose one job. We don't want Tim Murphy or John Shimkus to lose one job in their district because of this bill. Mr. Waxman doesn't want anybody to lose a job. But it is at least theoretically possible, and I would say it is an absolute economic fact of life, that people are going to lose jobs when electricity prices go up, because jobs are going to migrate. And they're not going to migrate somewhere else in the United States, because this act applies to every covered entity in the United States. So I would hypothesize that we should vote for this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
If I ask unanimous consent for you to be given an additional minute, would you yield it to me?
I will.
Without objection, gentleman has an additional minute, and I thank him for yielding to me. But I remember when we did the Clean Air Act, and people said we were going to lose all sorts of jobs. The cost of the economy was going to be so exorbitant that we wouldn't be able to sustain it. And they were wrong. We heard those predictions, and they were wrong. I would think that I have more confidence in the plan that Congressman Boucher developed and urged us to adopt, which we accepted, to allow the utilities to get the free allowances on condition that those free allowances be used to protect the ratepayers. I believe that's going to work. I believe it.
Mr. Chairman.
And I think that in doing that, we won't have the loss of jobs because of the cost of electricity. And during that period of time, we're going to be able to figure out ways to get our reductions from the carbon emissions, not by raising electricity prices, but by using the offsets, developing the technology, and moving toward a place where we can be more efficient and use renewables. I thank you, the gentleman. I exceeded the 1 minute. Yes, Mr. McNerney.
I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized.
You know, I certainly appreciate the concern about jobs, and we've heard over and over that this bill is going to cost jobs, as if saying it over and over would make it true, but the opposite is true. We're going to lose jobs if we don't pass this bill. In my mind, history is clear.
Yes,
I've lived it.
I have.
I worked in the wind industry. American money was spent creating wind turbine technology right here in this country, and because renewable energy wasn't supported, those jobs went overseas. Most wind turbines are manufactured in Europe right now. We need to bring those home. Today they're being manufactured in India, in Europe, and all other countries. Just the other week, just last week, there was an article in the New York Times showing that China now leads us in the production of clean coal. This process is happening again. We need to stop that. We need to allow innovation to return to this country and create jobs here. Moreover, other countries are going to start putting roadblocks in the way of our companies if we don't adopt greenhouse gas capping in this country. Europeans are going to do it if we don't participate in Copenhagen. So again, I certainly appreciate the desire of our colleagues to protect jobs. However, it seems to me that our colleagues on the other side of this aisle are more determined to stop the bill and to kill any chance we have of limiting carbon. But we haven't said a single word about the big elephant in this room, and that's global warming. It appears that the Republicans in this room, in this House, don't believe that global warming is a serious threat. Either they think it's not happening, or they think that if it is happening, humans are causing it, or if humans are causing it, it's too expensive for us to do anything about. In other words, let's keep our heads in the sand and hope for the best. That's defeatist. The scientific evidence is overwhelming that global warming is happening. The situation is urgent. We're dangerously close to tipping points. Do you want to go over and tell the next generation, the children that we heard about last night, and explain to them why we didn't take action while we had a chance? Well, we're in an emergency and we need to take action. This amendment that we're saying right now will allow global warming to proceed. I urge all of my colleagues to vote against it. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. I'd like to move to the vote on this amendment. Are members ready to proceed to the vote? Let's get a roll call vote, and who's seeking recognition? For what purpose does the gentleman seek it? Would the gentleman be willing to do it in 2 minutes? How many other members? Okay, how many other members are going to ask for recognition on this amendment? Okay, the gentleman's recognized for 2 minutes, and then we're going to go to the vote. I'm sorry, what are you saying to me? Are you saying something?
Marsha Blackman wanted recognition, I think.
Well, look, I'm willing to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Arizona and 2 minutes to the gentlewoman from Tennessee, Ms. Blackburn, and I'd like to then go to the vote, and I hope members will cooperate. Otherwise, I think we're gonna have to vote on it.
And point out that in this debate, the reality has been very different than we just heard. Not a single amendment has been offered on this side to repeal the bill instantaneously. Not a single amendment has been offered on this side to say the bill would never go into effect. Not a single amendment has been offered on this side to say we would have no cap and trade or no greenhouse gas program whatsoever. What we have said and said repeatedly is that we want there to be tests. We want there to be checkpoints. We want there to be, quite frankly, to use the language of the former chairman of the subcommittee on energy, off-ramps. Off-ramps that protect not us, not ourselves, not us personally, but our constituents, working men and women across America. We said one of those off-ramps ought to be if overall employment across the nation goes up, there ought to be an off-ramp. We said if gas prices go up dramatically, there ought to be an off-ramp. We said that if electricity prices go up beyond an acceptable limit, there ought to be an off-ramp. This particular amendment says that if there are increases, unacceptable increases in the employment of steel workers, there ought to be an off-ramp. And yet, we get rejected and rejected and rejected. But the argument that is made to reject us is bizarre. It is, we absolutely know on our side of the aisle, referring to the majority side of the aisle, that none of the things you're concerned about, the increase in unemployment nationally, won't ever happen, so we don't want an off-ramp. The gas prices that you're concerned about increases won't ever happen, so we don't want an off-ramp. The increases in electric prices won't ever happen, so we don't want an off-ramp. I would suggest that your conduct proves you don't have any faith that those things won't happen, because if you actually believed they would never happen, you would agree to allow each of these on-ramps, because you would say, yep, you're right, those are never going to happen, so we'll allow the suspension of this act if they ever do happen. And I think your conduct impeaches your words, and I yield back my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Tennessee, Ms. Blackburn.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I will be brief. Just a couple of points. The gentleman from California just mentioned that the global warming, this is irrefutable. The science is out there. I think he will be happy to know that this week in Nashville, Tennessee, we had a frost warning. Now, we've already been through blackberry winter, strawberry winter, dogwood winter, redbud winter, all those things that come in the spring when the weather starts to warm up and you are going through spring. Well, this week, we had a major cooling trend. We've had the coldest winter in 113 years. So there is much debate about whether or not global warming does really exist. Scientists refute this. When you talk about jobs and the future in children, I will tell you we are very concerned about jobs. And when I have a letter from Caterpillar put on my desk, and they're talking about losing jobs if we pass this legislation, it causes me to be very concerned for future generations, for children like my grandson who is 1 year old this week, and another grandchild that is going to arrive in June. What are we doing to the opportunities for them if we limit their opportunity for jobs and jobs growth? Last night or night before last, I asked if anybody had a copy of a study that could show that there were net job gains because of a country implementing cap and trade practices. What I have is the study from Spain that shows there are net job losses. We know the same thing happened in England, also in Germany, also in Denmark. I'm still waiting to see if there is any study from any country that shows they actually had a net jobs gain. So this is why we are saying, let's put some checks and balances in here. Let's have some times to revisit this if we need to revisit. I yield back.
Thank you for yielding back. We'll now proceed to a vote on the Murphy Amendment. The clerk will please call the roll.
Mr. Waxman?
No.
Mr. Waxman votes no. Mr. Dingle? Mr. Markey? Mr. Boucher? Mr. Pallone? Mr. Gordon? Mr. Gordon votes no. Mr. Rush? Ms. Eshue? Ms. Eshue votes no. Mr. Stupak? Mr. Stupak votes no. No. Mr. Inslee? Mr. Inslee votes no. Ms. Baldwin? Ms. Baldwin votes no. Mr. Ross? Mr. Weiner? Mr. Weiner votes no. Mr. Matheson? Mr. Butterfield? Mr. Butterfield, no. Mr. Melanson? Mr. Barlow? Mr. Barrow? Mr. Barrow votes no. Mr. Hill? Mr. Hill, no. Ms. Matsui? Ms. Matsui, no. Mrs. Christensen? Mrs. Christensen votes no. Ms. Castor? Ms. Castor votes no. Mr. Sarbanes? Mr. Sarbanes, no. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut? Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Space? Mr. Space, no. Mr. McNerney? Mr. McNerney votes no. Ms. Sutter? Sutton. I'm losing. Ms. Sutton? Ms. Sutton votes no. Mr. Braley? Mr. Welch? Mr. Welch, no. Mr. Barton? Mr. Barton votes aye. Mr. Hall? Mr. Hall, aye. Mr. Upton? Mr. Upton, aye. Mr. Stearns? Mr. Deal? Mr. Deal, aye. Mr. Whitfield? Mr. Whitfield, aye. Mr. Shimkus? Mr. Shattuck? Mr. Shattuck votes aye. Mr. Blunt? Mr. Blunt, aye. Mr. Boyer? Mr. Radonovich? Mr. Pitts? Mr. Pitts, aye. Ms. Bono Mack? Ms. Bono Mack, aye. Mr. Walden? Mr. Walden, aye. Mr. Terry? Mr. Terry, aye. Mr. Rogers? Mr. Rogers, aye. Mrs. Myrick? Mrs. Myrick, aye. Mr. Sullivan? Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania?
Aye.
Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania, aye. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess, aye. Ms. Blackburn? Ms. Blackburn, aye. Mr. Gingrey? Mr. Gingrey, aye. Mr. Scalise? Mr. Scalise, aye. Okay. Mr. Dingle? Mr. Dingle votes no. Mr. Boucher? Mr. Boucher, no. Mr. Matheson? Mr. Matheson, no. Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush votes no. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes no. Mr. Melanson. Mr. Melanson, no. Find him here. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross, no. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey, no. Here? Mr. Boyer. Mr. Boyer votes aye. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus votes aye. That's it. Okay.
All members respond to the vote. Anybody want to change the response to the vote? Clerk will report the vote.
On that vote, Mr. Chairman, the yeas were 20, the nays were 35.
The yeas were 20?
The yeas were 20.
20, okay. 20 ayes, 35 noes.
35, I apologize.
The amendment is not agreed to.